the current situation between the United States, the West, and Russia. We've learned from Reuters. They're talking about the new package of sanctions to be imposed on Russia by the end of this month, if I'm not mistaken. It was introduced 3 days ago. And the main goal of these sanctions are the Russian oil infrastructure and the bank system, the sector of the banking of Russia, the communication they have with the other countries. And Zelensky is pushing for, total disconnection of Russia with dollar. And what we've learned 5 months ago, 6 months ago from Russian president, that he said that they have reduced their dependence on dollar from 54% to 13% 5 or 6 months ago. And here is what Donald Trump said about the new sanctions and how he feels about them.
Putin basically said today that Russia is immune from U.S. sanctions. He said that it would not impact the Russian economy in any serious way. Is he
good.
wrong?
I'm glad he feels that way. That's good. I'll let you know about it in 6 months from now. Okay, let's see how it all works out.
John, just look at Pete Hegseth, please. Here, the reaction
Economy in any serious way. Is he
good.
wrong?
I'm glad he feels that way. That's good. I'll let you know about it in 6 months from now. Okay, let's see how it all works out.
Yeah, it's something.
Yeah.
What's your take? What's your understanding of this sort of strange behavior? Bizarre. It's so bizarre, and I don't know if we have any sort of, explanation for that. What's your take on what's going on?
It seems to me, Nima, that this is like an administration without a policy. And even worse than that, it's administration without an idea of what the policy should be. Either you're going to be neoconservative or you're not. You're going to be MAGA, America first. So one or the other. This issue with sanctions, it's as though the administration doesn't really understand that sanctions have less and less and less of an effect every time you use them. For example, immediately after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we piled sanctions on Russia with the idea being that we would paralyze the ruble and make such an economic catastrophe in Russia that the Russians would have to pull out. Well, since the invasion and the sanctions, the ruble is up 40% against the dollar. 40%. The Russians have turned instead to the Chinese. The Chinese have developed their own SWIFT system. So these banking transactions no longer go through New York. They go through Shanghai, which makes the Russians immune to American financial sanctions. So we have sanctioned other countries to the point where the sanctions don't have any effect. The sanctions don't work. Just this morning, we sanctioned President Petro of Colombia and his family only because he said something that made Donald Trump angry. That was it. And now we have sanctions on one of our closest allies in the Western Hemisphere. It doesn't make any sense. We're preparing to sanction Canada. We're preparing to sanction Ireland. None of this makes any sense anymore. I've long been opposed to sanctions as a foreign policy weapon. Look at Iran as another example. And forgive me if I'm repeating myself here, but we have had sanctions on Iran for 47 years. 47 years. Yet, if you go to Iran, and I have friends who are in Iran right now, you'll see daily life in the street being completely normal. Why? Because the Russians have strong economic relationships with the Iranians, rather, strong relationships with Russia, with China, with India. Iran is a member of the BRICS now. They don't need the United States. And because they've been so heavily sanctioned by the United States over so many years, they've had decades to work around those sanctions. It seems to me that every time the United States places sanctions on a country, it makes us a little bit weaker.
It reminds me of Donald Trump before being elected in the United States. He said the same thing. Why do we need to put sanctions on Iran and Russia? And that would hurt us. And you see, Donald Trump is totally different from what it was before.
Mm-hmm.
And who are these people, John? I, I think you know that there is a video in which Putin said that after anybody is elected, doesn't matter, Republican, Democrat, the people in dark suits come in and they give them the plan. This is the plan. Who are these people?
Well, I think the most obvious ones are Republican members of the U.S. Senate. We can talk about the deep state, certainly. But in terms of policy and the formulation of policy, the people who have the most effect, the most impact, the most influence with Donald Trump are Republican members of the U.S. Senate. Because just like members of the deep state, they're not going anywhere. I mean, we reelect 96% of our members of Congress, 98% of the Senate, 96% of the House. And so those senators are going to be there long after Donald Trump leaves. So what they are doing is trying to force a neoconservative foreign policy back into the White House and the State Department. And while they failed in the first Trump administration, they're largely succeeding now. All of a sudden, Donald Trump is doing things that MAGA Republicans should be furious about. And instead, it's just traditional Republican foreign policy sneaking back in. And it's because, I think, of Republican senators.
Yeah. These Republicans that you've mentioned, it seems that you're talking about people like Lindsey Graham and Ted Cruz and these people. How in the world Donald Trump would side with them against, you remember during the Russia Gate, few Republicans supported Donald Trump, few. And, and one of the most, one of the Republicans was Rand Paul, that he
Right.
did everything to support Donald Trump. Donald Trump right now is turning, just attacking him. People in Kentucky don't vote him, just remove him from. What is this sort of relationship? How? Because from what my understanding of Donald Trump is, anybody who seems friendly to him is going to support him. But that's not the case for
No.
Rand Paul. That's not the case for these people like Tucker Carlson. Who decides about this sort of policy? It's not personal. It's beyond that.
It is. It's beyond that. And isn't it interesting that it's only now that so many Republicans, especially conservative Republicans, are comfortable enough or feel safe enough to begin disagreeing with Donald Trump over U.S. policy toward Israel, for example. It's been Tucker Carlson that has led that fight. It's refreshing, but I think we're going to see more of it after the midterm elections, because Donald Trump. Here's the bottom line. The bottom line is Donald Trump is a lame duck. Donald Trump cannot run for president again. He's done. The Constitution is very, very clear. He can't run again. And a lot of Republicans believe that once Donald Trump departs the scene, the Republican Party as a party is going to return to a neoconservative policy that it has maintained since the end of the Second World War, really. So Lindsey Graham is going to become the old Lindsey Graham again, as horrible as that sounds. Ted Cruz is going to talk about invading other countries like he used to talk about all the time. And all of these people who have been worried that Donald Trump may damage their reelection efforts, or may say something mean about them, or may support a primary opponent running against them, they're all going to go back to the way things were. Feel free to criticize, even to criticize Donald Trump. They're just biding their time. Once they get past this next election, which is a year and a week from now, Donald Trump is going to be an afterthought. Even Barack Obama, who was far more popular than Donald Trump, even he realized that he was essentially done being president after year 6.
Do you think that the situation with Russia would lead to new escalations? Because in this new sort of sanctions, is this new package, they're talking about hitting the Russian oil infrastructure. They were
Right.
attacked physically by Ukrainians. And which we know, when we talk about Ukrainians, we have to consider that the targets, the intelligence, all came from the United States and the British. And they attacked them physically, and they're trying to sanction them, two sort of different attacks on their oil infrastructure. What is that? Do you think we are heading toward new escalations in Ukraine?
I do, and I'll tell you why. Well, besides the fact that the neoconservatives are reestablishing themselves, I've spoken over the last 2 weeks with some of the most important thinkers on the issue of Russian studies. Here in Washington, the chairman of the history department at American University, and a Russia expert, and the founder of the nuclear studies program, for example. And every one of these experts that I speak with say the same thing, which is remarkable. They say it independently of one another. And that is that the war is essentially over. Russia has won, right? The Russians, although they're advancing slowly, they're advancing. And every day they lose a little bit more territory. And so it's not in Russia's interest to end this war. Why would they want to? They're winning. Well, the only way that you can force the Russians to the negotiating table is to push them back. And the only way to push them back is to use American intelligence, British intelligence, German intelligence, and NATO hardware that you're giving to the Ukrainians to push them back. If you can't push them back physically on the ground, which the Ukrainians cannot, and NATO, of course, can't provide troops, because then that would be a declaration of war, you have them do something that is almost as dangerous, and that is to strike Russian infrastructure, especially oil and gas infrastructure. I think that would be a catastrophic error on the part of the West, because it ratchets up the level of violence in this war. And I think that we should then expect to see some sort of a Russian response. During the Vietnam War, one of the complaints that the United States had was that the Russians and the Chinese were arming and funding the North Vietnamese. Well, of course they were, because they wanted to push the United States out. Well, now, if we continue to arm and fund the Ukrainians, the Russians are going to make it worse for Ukraine and worse for us. The only way to go is up in escalation, and that's a very bad thing.